Okay, so the next section is this, and this is going to be our lightning quick run through biomolecules. So the first thing, carbohydrates. All right, they are a short-term, immediate source of energy. When we think of carbohydrates, the primary form of carbohydrate we think about is glucose. Okay, glucose is one of the reactants for cellular respiration. Okay, also CHO. That is the three elements you find in carbohydrates. So we use them for energy. There are some other things that glucose is used for. For example, cellulose. Cellulose is what we talked about. That is plant cell walls. Okay, it's a structural carbohydrate that is incredibly important, incredibly strong. Another form is starch. Starch is what plants store glucose as. If you remember way back, we talked about how it's really hard to store something that dissolves in water when it's in a very watery environment. Remember my story about SpongeBob going next door to Squidward's to borrow sugar because it kept dissolving. So plants convert glucose into starch, which they store. Think about a potato. A potato is nothing more than a massive store of starch in a potato plant. Okay, so carbohydrates, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Number one primary thing we think about them is energy in terms of glucose, right, as a reactant for cellular respiration. But we also know that plants have glucose in their cell walls and they store it as starch. Lipids. Okay, so lipids. We think of fatty acids and glycerol. All right, fatty acids are long chain long chain lipids. Also carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. When we're talking about lipids, right, so here's the thing. We use carbohydrates as the source of energy, but if we need to store energy, we store it as lipids, store of energy, right? Gram for gram, lipids store more energy. That's why the squirrels get all big and fat before they go into hibernation, so they can store the energy they need and break it down slowly over the entire winter and then convert it back into glucose so that they can use it for cell respiration. So think fat polar bears and fat squirrels. So that's one thing. Another thing that we talk about when we're talking about lipids is the cell membrane. Okay, the cell membrane is made of a phospholipid bilayer. So you've got a hydrophilic head and hydrophobic tails, and bi means two, so you've got two layers of them, and they form the cell membrane. And then obviously you've got these proteins that kind of go through them that provide channels that allow things to pass through. So you've got the cell membrane, okay, sometimes called the plasma membrane. So you've got long-term store of energy. They store the most energy of all of the biomolecules. So you store energy and you've got the cell membrane. Okay, proteins. Proteins are made from amino acids, and that codon chart tells us there are about 20 different amino acids. Okay, the building blocks of proteins are amino acids. Proteins, this is the most important thing about proteins, other than they're made from amino acids. They are shape specific. So every protein has to have a specific perfect shape that fits its job. If its shape is not the right shape, it can't do the job properly. So how do we make sure that the shape is proper? We make sure that the amino acids are in the correct order. And how do we do that? Well, if you remember back over here, when we're talking about transcription and translation, the shape of them, the order of the amino acids is controlled by your DNA. So in fact, your DNA is 100% down to controlling the shape of a protein to to do a proper job. And proteins equal our traits or our characteristics. Now, there are lots of proteins. We talked about enzymes that speed up the rate of chemical reactions. Okay, grandma's pizza. We'll come on to that in a minute. But then what fights diseases, right? So your body, when you take the COVID vaccine, your body produces antibodies, right? Antibodies are proteins that recognize the spike protein on the outside of the virus particle and can attack it because it knows it doesn't belong there. We've got the chemical messengers in our body, hormones. They are proteins, and they control, they are made in one part of the body, travel in the blood to another part of the body, where they make something happen. Like, for example, insulin is made in your pancreas but travels in the bloodstream to the liver to mop up extra blood sugar, extra glucose you've got in your blood. So these are just certain characteristics, along with all the other things like your hair color and your eye color and all that stuff. So proteins are made from amino acids. Their shape is critical to making sure that they can do their job properly, and that's coded for by our DNA. And there are hundreds of different types of proteins in your body. The last and CHON. So the nitrogen part is critical for proteins because that's what makes up the amino acids. Nucleic acids are the CHON and then the P for phosphate. And amino acids are built out of nucleotides. What is a nucleotide? It is this part here. And I've got one that's upside. I guess it looks a little upside down, but you've got this part here, which is the sugar. And in the case of DNA, it's deoxyribose. Okay? OSE always tells you it's a sugar, just like ASE always tells you it's an enzyme. So you've got the sugar, you've got the phosphate, and then you've got this bit, which is the nitrogen base. And if you remember, it is the order of these bases that is your genetic code. And there are 4 types of nitrogen bases. And the 4 types are A for adenine, T for thymine, G for cytosine, and G for guanine, and C for cytosine. And they complementary base pair. A always goes with T, G always goes with C, and they form this double helix shape. So that would be DNA. And the way you know it's DNA is if you look, if it's got 2 sides to it, it's DNA, right? This is DNA. But there's that other type of nucleic acid that's a single strand, that's RNA. And the biggest difference is in RNA, instead of a T, we have U for uracil. So if you see a U, you know you're talking about RNA. And that's the end of part, 5.